Okay, hey everyone, welcome to the lesson for dressing the pose. So, in our previous lesson, you should have finished all of the poses for your mannequin that will represent kind of the action or personality you want to portray for your character, in this case, witch or wizard. And so, what we'll do in this lesson is we're now going to dress the pose. Basically, the gist of this course is to now accumulate everything we've learned and kind of apply that onto this mannequin. Now, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to roughly sketch in kind of how you want this costume to look. Okay, so, and this is vastly different compared to when you're applying studies or when you're applying, technical things or knowledge that you need to gain. This is imagination, right? This is drawing from an imagination. This is concept art. This is, more abstract. And so you'll need to take a more abstract approach as well. So what you'll first do is based on the ref board that you made, right? Remember that I made you do a ref board based on 4 different categories. And now with that ref board, you're first going to just roughly sketch in, as you can see here, what I did in these blue lines, just roughly sketch in kind of the idea that you want for the costume of your witch or wizard. Now, I'm using a dynamic pose, so the shapes I'm going to put in will be more dynamic. The clothing will be more dynamic, so it will be a little bit different than if you're doing a neutral pose. But again, this sketching phase is just focusing on shapes and the type of costume you want to make and thinking about a little bit of the functionality. And again, all of these things should be present in your mood board. So it's almost like just repurposing what you see on the mood board and then adding that, roughly sketching that in onto your mannequin. We're not first going to immediately put in the clothing with all of its drapery and folds and material indication. None of that. We're going to do something similar to what you did in Module 2, where you needed to dress a mannequin with the shapes that represent that clothing, right? So all you need to do is draw a manipulated form before we move into actually applying the costume. So this is kind of an extra layer that I want you to go through, an extra step before we complicate things with drapery and folding. And this is crucial because when we're doing something like this from imagination, we need to get spatially aware before we do anything else, right? Because the form kind of needs to make sense. What we're projecting onto the body, this costume, it needs to fit the pose it's kind of assuming, and the clothing needs to feel volumetric. It needs to feel like this is fitting around the body. So I don't want you to stress about the folding first. I first want you to worry about, am I accurately representing the simple form of this costume that I've sketched in before we move on and indicate all of the pretty stuff like folding and drapery. Okay, so I'm going to take my mood board and I'll occasionally overlay it in the video here so you guys can see what I'm actually looking at. But I've showed you in lesson 3 of this module. And so yours should look different because you're going to draw some different wizard or witch, and the type is going to differ, and the clothing and the costuming that you're picking and the artist that you're inspired by, that's all going to be different from what I'm doing. Keep that in mind, but I do want you to, I want to take you through my thought process when I'm doing this. So based on this ref board, I have sketched in these rough sketches around the pose. And from there, I'm just going to now indicate the simple form that this kind of costuming would occupy. For the shirt and the sleeve, I've kind of based it on some things I saw in my inspirational board and something I saw in my design board. And so I'm going to add this in just with the simple volume. Right? So as you can see here for the sleeve that I have right here, I'm just going to indicate kind of the simple manipulated volume it's going to occupy. And as you can see, it's kind of it's a cylinder, inflated cylinder with a hole cut out of it. Kind of that's the idea of this thing, right? And so it's going to be the same thing on the other side. And again, I'm not yet worried about folding or how this would insert into different folding. I'm just worried about the volumes that I'm representing with these simple forms. Right, and then I have a shirt that is wrapping around the shoulders and then tucking into a belt. So the kind of the midline belt that I'm like, so it's almost like it's also like a corset, but a little bit more self-made. I'm basing that on one of the belts that I see on my detail section, not the left one, but the right one. That's a little bit more, how'd you call that? A little bit more hippie. I don't want to call it hippie, but for lack of a better term, a little bit more natural, not as tailored. It's a little bit more freely made, and I like that because it kind of represents the witch that I'm trying to design. But again, I'm not going to draw all of the individual shapes that I see in this reference. I'm just going to draw the encompassing big form that I need to be aware of in my spatial awareness. All right, and then I'm going to draw the bracers, which is basically a very simple cylinder, right? And then I really like the pauldrons made out of feathers, right? It kind of gives me this more druidy feeling, but I really like it, and I think it's fitting for a witch as well. Now, I'm not going to draw all of those feathers. I'm just, again, going to draw the encompassing shape. So for me, I'm going to basically treat it as a pauldron. And a pauldron, from what we've seen in the ArtWatt program, when we draw them, when we simplify them, it's usually like half a cylinder. Or half a sphere, sorry, depending how you look at it. So I'm going to draw the same, right? So I'm just going to draw this kind of encompassing shape that will make up those feathers. Again, I'm only worried about volumes. I'm not worried about anything else, just manipulating form to represent kind of the costume that I want to design. Right, and so then, again, based on that belt that I was looking at, we can kind of see this like tabard, and I really like the tabard. It kind of breaks up the skirt as well that I'm going to draw in later. So I think it's a cool part of the design, kind of breaks it up, creates a little bit more asymmetry. So that's what I'm going to add in. So we're just going to make sure that this already follows the kind of dynamic pose that my figure is striking. So we're not going to draw this tabard like straight down, right? That's not representative of the volume and the pose. So again, that's why we're doing this exercise first. So it's going to be a little bit flaring out, and it's going to be a little bit sideways, a bit tilted. So it's going to be something like this. That's kind of the shape that I'm imagining for this tabard. And then the skirt, I'm basing it on one of the functional skirts that I see from, a medieval reenactment. It's the brown skirt in particular. And what I really like about it, it's not just an open-ended skirt. It also has this, because it's so long, what they used to do is they used to fold it over and tuck it in to their belt. And it kind of creates this really interesting shape that I'm also going to use for my witch design. Now, I'm not already going to draw that in. I'm just going to represent kind of the simple shape it is creating. And so in order to do that, I need to take a closer look at what the belt does exactly. But from what I can see, so the belt is kind of, to give you an idea, the skirt, I'm sorry, it's kind of open like this. They're taking this part down here and they're folding that over and tucking it underneath the belt like this. So all of this gets folded upwards and this kind of falls over that belt. Right? So it creates a really interesting shape that I really like and I'm going to mimic in my design. And so the other part of that half skirt will probably go down a little bit more like this before it will get lost behind the other skirt. So I'm doing a 2-skirt kind of layer just to create some interest again in the design. And it's also something that I'm seeing in my reference. So I'm just gonna kind of use it because I really like it. And so based on that, I'm not going to draw any folds yet. Okay, guys, keep that in mind. I'm just going to think about what the skirt would be doing volume-wise, right? Right, and that's going to create a little bit of a tangent with the tabard that I definitely don't want. So I'm just going to shorten that skirt a little bit. All right. Then a simple manipulated sphere for one of those satchels that she's carrying, and she's carrying 2 of them in my design. So again, simple manipulated sphere like this. Get rid of what's underneath. And then I really like this kind of cup that they're wearing. Something that I've also picked up from one of the reference photos that I have of these reenactments, which is really cool. It's kind of a detail that you don't come across that often. So that's why these kind of reenactment photos are really cool to have. So this cup, I'm going to just draw it in as I see it. And this is easy, right? This is basically a very simple cylinder being held up by the belt. But I'm not even going to bother drawing in the belt yet. I'm just going to again draw that other satchel on the other side. And then lastly, I'm also going to count the hair as something that we need to represent volumetrically and also treat a little bit as folds and drapery, right? Because a cool thing about hair is that you can sometimes treat it as drapery when it kind of, you know, it has its diaper folds. Sometimes it has pipe folds. So it definitely has spiral folds. So all of this knowledge you can use with hair as well. It's just you will need to change the texture a little bit. But I'm just going to represent the simple volumes for now. And I'm basing that again just on something that I see from my design portion of the ref board. And I'm just going to design the simple forms as I see them. Nothing more, nothing less. Right. It's definitely not going to look pretty yet. And that's not the idea. It's kind of a misconception that a lot of you have, that everything needs to immediately look pretty, which is not the case. We just want to have some accurate representation of what we're drawing. And then what I advise you to do is also indicate the midline for all of the volumes that you've established. So what this will help you do is it will kind of reestablish those volumes. And it should give you a little bit of an easier time figuring out where all of this sits in space. Okay, so now we have established our mannequin pose. We have established the rough indication of the shapes we kind of wanted for the costume. And then we've established our manipulated forms and volumes that are going to make up that costume. So the only thing that remains is now actually physically drawing the drapery that we want those simple forms to represent, and then sort of add some finishing touches based on what we have in our mood board, especially in the detail section, kind of things we want to do or add to elevate the design, right? I want to emphasize that the goal of this course, the end result, is not to have a character design, okay? It's merely to have a costume that could be worn by a character. So I'm going to end this design with just a mannequin, right? So it's just going to be a mannequin wearing a costume. Now, if you want to take this further and you really like what you've done and you want to transform that into a real character, you want to add facial expression, you want to add some anatomy, by all means, go ahead, okay? But that's not the goal, and you will not be graded for it either, all right? If some of you that are requesting grading for this course, you won't need to do that. The only thing you'll need to do is have these 4 steps, which I'll later reiterate in the assignment part, okay? So, moving on, I'm now just going to start adding drapery and start adding it based on what I know and based on what I can see and gather from my reference. All right, so make sure that I'm on a new layer. And so the first thing that I'll do is I'll probably go over the shirt first because that's something I really want to establish. So we have this shirt kind of tucking into the belt, like the waist belt or corset. And I'm basing that off of one of the images that I have on my reference board. And it's a super loose kind of corset, right? So it's not skin tight. So I'm even going to reiterate some of the design that I have on it. And I need to make sure that when I want to make this believable, so making sure that what I'm drawing here kind of represents the type of clothing that I want to portray, I need to make sure my folds are correct, right? So we have kind of this little cutout that I can see in the reference, which is held together by a piece of rope. Can make that rope a little bit dynamic as well. And so a lot of what we'll see here is compressed folds, right? So this is going to be a combination of pipe folds and spiral folds, because we'll have some twisting going on because of the dynamic nature of this pose. So that's what I'm going to indicate. And of course, as always, with anything that has excess folding, we're going to have some sort of half logs, right? That's only natural that we're going to have something like that. So this is literally what I'm doing now based on what I see from the reference, a little bit from what I know from folding and drapery. And then into the sleeve, same thing. I'm not using the sleeves that I see on the same reference. I'm using ones that I've seen in my inspiration board. So I'm kind of, mix and matching what I like. So these are a little bit more puffy shoulders. Sleeves, I'm sorry. And this is also important, guys. Naturally, because I've done this a lot, I've cultivated a little bit of my own style, right? And if you remember from what we did in the beginning of this module, we did style repurposing. So if you've learned anything from that, which you should, right? The way you represent a certain fold or the way that you stylize something, if that's something you want to use in this phase, by all means, be my guest. It might be hard because you're now combining drawing from imagination with adding structure, adding believability, and adding folding. Adding stylization on top of that might be a hard ask right now, which is something I'm definitely not asking from you to do. But if you want to do it, by all means. So we'll definitely have some pinching going on from the bracers. And I'm choosing to represent a spiral fold here because she's basically stretching out that sleeve, right? She's stretching it out and then bending her arm. But the stretching is going to be the dominating factor here. Right, I'm going to stick on this side for a second, and I'm going to do that feather pauldron, which I really liked. So again, what I did was I drew the encompassing shape, and now I'm just going to literally add the feathers on top. As always, try to add some variety in shape and size. Also, by the way, if you're doing this traditionally, you would go about it the exact same way. You would just add a pose first, then draw with a blue, pencil or whatever kind of color you want to use. Draw the shapes on top, and then you can either erase that a little bit and draw the volumes on top of that, or you can redraw it and draw the volumes there, or kind of copy it, use a copy machine if you want to. That's all good. Okay. I'm gonna add a white layer on top underneath here so I can check kind of how everything's looking without my underdrawing. So yeah, that's looking good. I'm gonna draw the other sleeve. So again, she is moving her hands towards the camera. I'm kind of imagining that she's using her wand and then drawing magic from that wand to kind of cast a spell towards the camera. And so she's really, it's not completely stretched, it's a little bit bent. That's why you see a breakup like I have it in my pose. But it's going to be fairly stretched. Now what that means for the sleeve, however, is it will probably have something similar to what we have with the other sleeve. It's just it's fanning out. And then going around because I need to think about the volumes. Now the thing is though, here we do have some foreshortening, right? Because we have the bracers that are gonna fit on this arm coming towards the camera, and then that bulbous kind of sleeve is sitting around that. So I need a way to represent that, which comes from experience, with foreshortening. But again, the bracer's kind of easy, right? Because it's instead of a cylinder. And I hope you can see that on the screen. Instead of a cylinder like this, we literally rotate that thing towards us, and it's more like something like that, right? So our bracers are going to sit like this. Indicate some finishing touches already, just to indicate that it's bracers. We can add maybe some like stitching going around to indicate that it's leather. We can do that on the other bracer as well, just for consistency. Right, and then I'm not just gonna close off that sleeve, right? I'm gonna, because as you can see what I did on the other sleeve, it's because it's so, there's so much sleeve, right? There's so much fabric. It's going to pinch together underneath the bracer, but then the rest of it is just going to fall down, right? It's going to literally fall down due to gravity. Now, it's not actually going to create like a drop fold. It's more going to create some sort of a diaper fold, but it's a connected diaper fold, right? Because we have 2 points of tension and they're literally going towards each other almost. Right, but it is going to be closed off, of course, because it's like it's one sleeve going into the other, and it's sort of hard to explain, but you will see, like in the reference that I have, it's a little bit more apparent, and I'll try to share that in the video. I am going to add a little bit of like movement to it, just because we have a dynamic pose. And with that, I'm probably going to create a bit of overlap to suggest the thickness of this fabric. Like this. Right, something like that. Then moving on into waist belt, I'm going to just use what I see on screen. I'm not going to add any fancy detailing. I'm not going to worry about shape language at this point. I just want to represent something using information that I have on my ref board. So I really like this sort of, I'm not sure what to call it, more of an alternative way of creating a corset, I guess. It's really interesting. It's beautiful, beautifully made as well. So it's made up of 2 pieces, and I'm going to use that information as well. Now the thing here is that it's not made of leather, and what that does is it's made out of thicker cloth, like probably cotton. Now it's going to create what it is going to create. If I were to design this for a real character, I would probably go with leather. The reason for that is it's going to have a material change between what we have for the shirt and then the corset and then again into the skirt. Otherwise, everything's cloth, right? Which might be confusing, especially material-wise, especially if this were to go into rendering, into 3D, and then modeling, and then texturing. It might create a noisy feeling, but I'm not worried about that at this point, right? I'm just worried about just creating something that looks believable. And so I'm just going to follow what I see on screen because this is cloth, we can now add cool folding. Right, that's what we're particularly worried about in this course. So what that means is this is not going to perfectly follow the silhouette of my mannequin. What it is going to do is going to, bunch up a little bit and kind of create this half log, right? Because we're gonna because we have that pinch on the other side, which is something when it comes to posing, especially dynamic posing, is always look for this stretch versus pinch of the figure. You'll see this a lot. If I move my body this way, like there will be a pinch in the other side of my body, right? Same thing for if I do something with my arm. If I do something like this will stretch and this will pinch, right? So there's always some kind of pinching and stretching going on. So we have the same thing here, and we can exaggerate that in our clothing representation. And when I do that, we are instantly creating more of a feeling of clothing, right? Because leather would never do that. Right, so it's going to be fairly similar on the other side. And I'm already going to add some of the trimming that I'm seeing. So because it's stretching a little bit more on the other side, I am going to emphasize that a little bit, because what I see in the reference is there's the same kind of bulging and half log going on the other side. I don't want to do that. I want to create that difference between the pinch side and the fold side. And what I really love about this is that there's some kind of roping going on, and there's this triangular sort of leather bits where the roping kind of attaches. And then comes out the other side into some sort of a knot. And I'm just going to mimic that, right? It's really powerful. It's really useful. It adds some interest to the design as well. So we'll just use it. All right, let's check again. Yeah, that's looking good. Now I want to include all of these alternative kind of braided robes that this girl in this image is using. So, and what I'm going to do is, because I have some of the detailing and functional aspects that I have that I want to include from like the cup and the satchels that these women are using, I'm going to try, and this is kind of where design comes in, right? I'm going to try and find a midway between, because they're using a leather belt to add the cup and the satchel to the belt. I don't want to do that. I want to use that thick robing. So I'm going to use the functionality of the satchel and the cup. And I'm going to use the braided aspect of what I have in the corset. The only thing I need to do in terms of add some believability to it, I need to make sure that it works, right? That satchel and that rope can actually hang around that more alternative belt instead of the leather belt. So we have a thick leather belt, a thick braided belt, I'm sorry, like this, going around and then inward. I'm not even going to try and design it a different way. I just really like the way I see it here. So I'm just going to use that information. Sometimes people have already invented a cooler way of doing things, so don't always try to reinvent the wheel. And then this kind of goes down into sort of a thicker knot. And then some, almost like curtain draping. Still really cool though. I'm going to get rid of some of these lines. All right. And now, like I said, that functionality, I need to insert that into what is normally a leather belt. Now I'm going to have to draw that onto this braided belt, but it's going to be the exact same thing, right? So I'm going to use some artistic liberty and say that our witch is using a combination of both braided and leather material. She's a witch, right? She can do what she wants. Right, so and we'll have that kind of leather belt strapped around like this. And then the cup kind of look like this. And then same thing for the satchel, right? It, of course, needs to be wrapped around that belt as well. And so with a satchel, what you have, right, because this is basically a big bag and then tied together, knotted together, like really held tight together by one rope. So that rope is compressing everything, like, and it's almost like a reverse skirt, literally, right? Where you have, if you have a belt that I showed you from a skirt, right, and that skirt kind of fans out, and it creates all of these pipe folds, right? Remember? So what a satchel does is the exact same thing, but in reverse, right? So the satchel, it of course it's compressed against the body, and then it has its kind of typical satchel shape, and then that literally is held together by some type of belt or roping that is usually braided into the holes of, like, it goes in and it comes out and then it goes in. And so that's strapped together, and then we kind of get this reverse skirt. Right? That's kind of what a satchel is. At least some of them. Some of them also have these typical flaps. It all depends a little bit, but because we're doing folds, we're creating that typical satchel look. And then the rope kind of probably goes out like this, straps together here. And then because it's usually like a satchel is more leathery, it will have thicker folds, right? But it will still have folds because everything's going towards that tension point. All right. Okay, so far so good for our witch. Let's move on. First thing I want to do is probably add in this tabard going down the middle of her skirt. That's something I just wanted to add in because I really like it. It kind of breaks up the vast shape of the skirt as well. So I'm going to do that based on one of the designs I already did for a game called Zombicide, which is a board game by Simon. A really cool game, a lot of fun to work on. And so I'm going to use a little bit, I'm going to steal a little bit of my own shape language here. Just have a little bit of fun with it. Now I'm not going to do it like I did with Simon, of course, so it's not going to be as white. But I do want to do something similar, just to get a little bit of a difference of material as well going on. And again, this is something that I usually like to do a little bit is I always want my pose to match the clothing or the way the clothing acts. So if I have a very dynamic pose, I'm gonna up the dynamic of or the dynamic nature of my clothing, right? So I'm gonna swirl out things more. I'm gonna make them more dynamic. I'm gonna add intensity to them, probably more tension, more compression, just because I want to sell that pose, right? I want to make you feel like this is what the character is doing. Now, if we have a normal neutral pose, which a lot of you might be doing, then it doesn't really make sense that we have all of these swirling things around them, although they do sometimes do that in photography where we have a neutral pose and then they'll use like wind machines to create this dynamic nature, because of course it breaks up the silhouette. So I'm not saying don't do it, but I always like to represent more real life scenarios, let's say. All right, then let's say we have some satchels hanging down here that maybe have a little bit more of these drooping down. So this is more like, this is drop folds, right, that we're creating, and maybe this overlaps that braided rope a little bit. Like this. And then one on your side as well. All right, let's double check. Looking good, looking good. All right, so now for the skirt part. Remember what I told you previously is that I really like that shape that the skirt is kind of creating, because it's a skirt that is open on the side, but in order to not have it drag on the ground, what these women in this particular reenactment do is they kind of bunch it up underneath their belt, which I really like. But because I already have a lot of detailing going on, I'm not going to be able to show everything. However, I can still use the shapes and the folding that I see in the reference. So I'm still going to use it because I really like the folds that are being created. And essentially, what we have here, when you look at it, and I'll put the reference up in the video when I'm talking about this, is these are very, very aggressive diaper folds, because we essentially have 2 points of tension relatively close to each other that then instantly, because of the weight of the skirt, they just go down, they droop down completely, and they meet in the middle, right? It's basically like a diaper fold, but it's a little bit more extreme because the points of tension are not that wide across. But really beautiful, beautiful folds actually to draw and study. So we also have some really cool kind of half locks going on, because basically it's almost inert kind of folding at this point, but we have like a half lock going on here within the diaper fold, which is really interesting. And then this kind of goes down, and what I'm trying to avoid is falling into the trap of being manipulated by what I see. And what I mean by that, and I talk about this a lot because props to Jeffrey Watts, I learned it from him, is you want to understand what you see, right? You want to be able to manipulate what you see, not be manipulated by it, which is of course essentially important. And so I don't want to fall into the trap of following kind of the shape language that I'm getting out of this skirt, because shape language in real life is boring. So I want to still use that big, medium, small rule. And this comes down to a little bit more design and design knowledge in order to elevate the interest, the visual interest of our design. All right, and then we essentially have this other skirt coming out, and that is forming some really interesting drop folds and pipe folds. And again, I don't want to fall into the kind of real life design trap. I want to create my own designs, create my own interesting folds. Let's have a look. And now here's something that will probably be hard for you to take into account. And that is the effect that your mannequin will have on the clothing. So what we tend to do is we tend to look at where the compression points are and where the tension points are, and then draw accordingly. But you have a moving body underneath this clothing. And so what I have with my mannequin, for instance, now, she has one leg coming forward. Now what this will do is she will definitely be hitting that clothing, right? Because she's propelling that leg forward. Again, this is that drag and kind of follow through that I've been talking about. So we need to take that into account, because the way I have it right now is I can sort of see that my body is twisting based on what I've already drawn. But I need to see that leg coming through, because I need to see at least one of the legs being shown, kind of having an influence on this skirt. So I can do that based, of course, on what I get, the information that I get from all of the reference that I have. And it's definitely tricky. It's definitely tricky, but I'm gonna choose my knee as an extra point of tension coming forward. And so what that will do is it will create a new point of tension. And I'm going to show a little bit of, because I can see it in the underdrawing, right? I'm going to show a little bit of the skirt kind of going over a volume that's underneath. And this is going to give us, as the viewer, the indication that there's something volumetric underneath here, right? Can you see that? I hope you can. And probably this isn't indicative of what would happen in real life, but at some point we need some artistic liberty, right? We need to not care. We need to just go for believability, not realism, because it's so much more interesting. And of course, this is something you also need to take into account. Like, what type of material is the skirt that the leg is having, is having influence on? Because if it's very thick, again, cotton, those folds that I just draw that are going to have influence might be thicker, right? If it's silk, they might be a lot more of them. So these are all things that you should really consider, because that's going to really help the believability of your designs. Right, so we're definitely going to still have some tension coming from that corset belt. So that's definitely something I want to show in my skirt. Right, and then finally, let's add some boots, which I'm going to use the ones that I established on that character that I did for Zombicide, because I really like him. They have a touch of like this vintage feeling. So this is going to be kind of a softer leather material, right? So I'm going to be careful with the amount of folds and the thickness of those folds. Right? Those folds are going to be thicker, a lot thicker. Now, when it comes to the hair, I want to do the kind of the hair that I'm just seeing of this beautiful girl in or woman in this photograph that I have on my ref board, and I'm always going to copy it one to one, just stylize it a little bit, which is she has a little bit of this midsection going down half of her head, and then it kind of clusters together, almost forming like these spiral folds essentially, right? Because it twists around the head. It kind of bulks out a little bit on the top and the bottom. And so the same thing is happening on the other side. Again, all of these spiral folds. And then essentially we have, again, folds created by compression, right? But just with hair. But the difference is the same, as they say in Belgium. So there's nothing essentially different about hair and drapery. Of course there is in terms of material, but when it comes to like folding, compression, it's very similar. So the only thing, and you'll probably have heard this a lot, just think about hair as a group. So, or think of a cluster of hair as ribbons, and then treat those ribbons as drapery, right? So it can have spiral folds, it can have diaper folds, and the only thing that's going to be important is having some sort of variety and interest in the shape. All right, and so this will conclude the bulk of this lesson that I want you to do for this, end of the course design. We will do a little bit of a touch up after this, just a smaller lesson where you can basically spend a little time on detailing. But for this lesson, which is the most important lesson, because we're going to bring together everything that we've learned so far, what I want you to do is basically 3 different assignments, right? So you've picked your pose from the previous lesson. You've added a rough sketch on top that is representing the type of costume that you want to build. Then you add a layer on top or a different sketch that represents the simple manipulated forms that will eventually encompass the drapery that you're going to design. And then finally, as step 3, you are now going to add the drapery and folding on top based off everything you've gathered in your mood board. So that's your assignment for this lesson. It's a lot to do. Please spend most of your time on this lesson, right? And make sure you do every step diligently, even the sketch process, right? Think about the shapes you want to use before moving on to the simple manipulated forms. Okay? Have fun, everyone, and I'll see you in the final lesson. Bye-bye.